At exactly 4:27 inches the morning, something began to feel wrong. There was no sound, no visible movement, but the sensation was there, crawling beneath the skin of every man on the battlefield. Impossible to ignore. The feeling was not ordinary fear. It was something deeper, more instinctive, as if the body itself knew, before the mind, that something was about to change in an irreversible way. The silence that surrounded the soldiers that morning was not the silence of peace or rest. It was dense, suffocating, artificial, as if the entire world had deliberately stopped breathing. The cold cut through their uniforms with relentless precision, tightening their muscles, making every movement heavier, every gesture slower, as if the air itself resisted their presence there. A thick fog stretched across the ground with no apparent end, swallowing shapes, distorting distances, and turning everything familiar into something uncertain, almost unrecognizable. The battlefield had ceased to be a place they knew. That morning, it felt like a space suspended between reality and illusion, where no detail could be entirely trusted. The soldiers remained motionless at their positions, each one locked inside their own thoughts, unable to share the silent weight they carried in that moment. Their hands gripped their weapons slightly harder than necessary, not by order, not by training, but by pure instinct, as if their bodies were trying to anchor themselves to something concrete. Every man's breathing was slightly heavier, more controlled, more conscious than it should have been, the kind of breathing that happens when someone is trying not to show that they are afraid. Eyes swept through the fog, searching for answers that simply did not exist. There was nothing visible, no clear response, no shape that could confirm what everyone already felt. No one spoke. No one dared to break that silence, which seemed fragile, yet threatening at the same time, like thin glass holding up an enormous weight. But everyone felt it. Without needing words, without needing signals, everyone knew. Something was coming. Something large. Something that would change everything. Among the men, silent thoughts filled the space with the same intensity that the fog filled the air, dense, heavy, and impossible to dispel. Some soldiers carried folded letters in their pockets, written in moments of calm that now seemed to belong to another life, distant and almost unreal in the face of that morning. Those letters held words for loved ones, promises of return, fragments of hope, fears hidden between the lines, feelings that might never be read by anyone. Others murmured prayers in low voices, barely moving their lips, as if they were afraid that the very sound of their voices might break something fragile and essential in that moment. They hoped that someone was listening somewhere beyond the chaos of war, beyond the uncertainty that surrounded them. For many, it was not merely faith. It was a silent form of despair disguised as hope. Among all the men in that field, there was Sergeant Daniel, a man shaped by war, sharpened by experience, marked by everything he had seen and survived. Daniel was not fearless. He simply understood fear in a way that few could. He knew how to recognize it, respect it, and use it before it used him. His eyes moved constantly, sweeping the horizon, trying to see through the fog, searching for anything that could explain the growing tension in the air around them. But there was nothing visible. Only silence. And that silence was different from every other silence Daniel had ever known in years of war. It was not empty. It was loaded. Like a trigger already pressed but not yet fired. Like a word suspended in the air before falling with its full weight. Time stretched unnaturally, each second advancing as if it carried its own weight, as if anticipation had become a physical force capable of altering the passage of time itself. The longer it lasted, the more unbearable it became. Each heartbeat seemed louder. Each breath seemed heavier. The stillness pressed around them, refusing to yield. And then, almost imperceptibly, something changed. A minimal shift in the air, a subtle vibration that had not existed a second before and was now undeniably present. A sound began to emerge in the distance. Faint at first, mixed with the wind, easy to dismiss, as the imagination of tense and exhausted minds. Some soldiers did not react at all. Others tilted their heads slightly, uncertain about what they were hearing. trying to separate the real from the imagined within that dense fog. But Daniel knew immediately. Before the sound was clear enough for the others, before anyone else could identify it, he already knew with absolute certainty he had heard that sound before, in other fields, in other early mornings, in other moments that still inhabited his dreams with total clarity. Engines, not one, not just a few, many. A quantity that transformed the distant sound into something far greater than any individual attack could represent. The realization hit him instantly, sending a surge of adrenaline through his entire body. His pulse quickened, his senses sharpened, and instinct took control before thought could fully form. There was no time to hesitate. There was no room for doubt. There was no margin for the kind of pause that separates survival from tragedy. Daniel screamed. His voice cut through the silence with absolute urgency, ordering the men to take position, to prepare, to move. The tone alone was enough to snap some of them out of their thoughts. But even as they began to react, it quickly became clear that the warning had come too late. Just a moment, just a fraction of a second, but too late, because in the very next instant, the sky exploded. Emerging from the darkness, cutting through the fog with terrifying precision, the bombers appeared. Their presence was overwhelming. They moved fast and unstoppable, like shadows of death descending from above. Like something inevitable that no order, no shout, and no preparation could have completely prevented. There was no time to think. There was no time to organize. There was no time to fully understand what was happening before it was already happening with full force. The first explosion struck the ground with devastating power. The earth shattered beneath them, sending a violent shockwave across the entire battlefield within fractions of a second. Bodies were hurled into the air. Structures collapsed instantly. Everything around them seemed to fragment at once, as if the physical reality of the place had been undone in seconds. The sound that followed was beyond any possible comprehension. It was not simply noise. It was a force, a brutal presence that did not enter through the ears. It occupied everything. Explosions, screams, torn metal, and roaring fire merged into a single overwhelming presence that consumed the air, the ground, the senses, and any possibility of clarity or control. Discipline collapsed instantly. The formation dissolved. The structured reality of military order disappeared in seconds, replaced by something far more primitive and far more honest: survival. That was the only order that still made sense, the only law that still applied, the only thing each man could comprehend within that absolute chaos. Daniel was violently thrown to the ground, his body slamming against the earth as the force of the explosion expelled the air from his lungs, leaving him for a moment completely breathless. His hearing disappeared into a sharp, constant ringing that muffled everything around him. For a moment, the world felt distant, disconnected, as if it were happening somewhere too far away to reach. But reality returned quickly, and when it returned, it was violent, immediate, without any consideration for the state he was in. It simply came back with full force. Men ran in every direction. Some cried out for help, desperate and broken voices that barely seemed human amid that chaos. Others screamed in pain. Some tried to move, but fell before they could take more than a few steps. Others did not move at all. Still others remained standing, but with completely vacant eyes. Machine gun fire erupted almost immediately, cutting through the air with relentless precision. Bullets moved too fast to be seen, turning every open space into a deadly risk. The ground itself seemed to come alive, exploding repeatedly under continuous bombardment, as if even the earth beneath their feet had become an enemy in that moment. There was no safe place. There was no direction that offered protection. There was not a single moment to think clearly or make a decision based on anything beyond immediate instinct. And then there was the smell. It spread rapidly, dense and suffocating, unlike anything that words could describe with adequate precision. Burning fuel, hot metal, shattered earth, and something worse than all of it, something that lingered, something that became embedded, something that no soldier ever fully forgot. Daniel forced himself to move. Every part of his body resisted, heavy with shock and exhaustion, but instinct pushed him forward without stopping, without asking permission. He crawled across the destroyed ground, using whatever fragment of cover still remained, desperately searching for a way to survive what seemed impossible to survive. It was then that he saw him, a young soldier, no more than a boy, standing just a few meters away, completely still amid the total chaos all around, frozen, completely motionless. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, fixed on nothing, as if his mind had gone somewhere the chaos could not reach. His body trembled uncontrollably, but he did not move. It was as if the chaos around him had become too vast to process, too vast to understand, too vast to exist inside him. Daniel shouted at him. Direct, loud, without softness, the kind of shout that does not ask, that orders, that demands, that reality be acknowledged. There was no response at all. The boy did not react. His eyes did not change. His body did not respond. He kept standing there, trembling, absent, as if Daniel were not there, as if the shout had not reached wherever he was. Another explosion struck close by, sending earth and debris raining down around the two of them, shaking the ground beneath their feet with enough force to knock them down. Daniel had reached a point of choice. Keep moving, survive, escape, save himself, or go back. For a boy who perhaps could no longer be saved by anyone, for a fraction of a second, time seemed to pause. The noise receded just enough for that decision to fill everything not as a dilemma, but as a weight that needed to be carried one way or the other. Then he turned. He crawled toward the boy, ignoring the chaos, ignoring the danger, ignoring everything his own survival instinct said was the sensible path. He grabbed the boy by his uniform and pulled hard, shouting directly into his face, forcing his voice through the fear that had taken complete control of that young body. At first, nothing changed. The boy was not resisting intentionally. He simply could not. The fear had rooted him in place, locking his body like an invisible chain. But Daniel did not stop. He shouted again, louder this time, refusing to accept absence as an answer, refusing to let fear win without a real fight. He pulled harder, forcing movement where there was none, forcing reality back into a mind that had shut down as a protective mechanism against the unbearable. And slowly, something changed. The boy blinked, a small gesture, almost insignificant, practically imperceptible amid everything going on. But it meant everything. It was the sign that someone was still there. His body responded weak at first, uncoordinated, uncertain, like someone waking from a deep dream into a world that still did not make complete sense. Daniel did not hesitate. He pulled him up, forcing him to stand, forcing him to move, transforming the fragile impulse into real movement with everything he had. Together, they ran, without knowing exactly where, without a defined plan, without certainty that there was a safe destination waiting for them on the other side of that hell. They stumbled through smoke and fire, crossing a battlefield that no longer resembled anything human, only fragments and ruins of what had existed minutes before. Around them, the destruction stretched with no apparent end, turning everything into pieces of what had been. There was no clear direction of escape, no safe signal to follow, only movement. Only the act of pressing forward, of putting one foot in front of the other, of keeping the body moving even when everything seemed impossible to overcome. Around them, some soldiers tried to fight back, firing blindly into the sky, desperate to recover even the smallest sense of control over what was happening to them. Their efforts were brave, but they were useless against the scale of that attack. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The explosions faded. The machine gun fire slowed, and silence returned once more to the battlefield. But this silence was different from all the ones before it. It was heavier. It carried the weight of everything that had happened in those minutes, every explosion, every scream, every life that had been altered forever. 5 minutes. That was it. Only 5 minutes had passed since the first explosion. 5 minutes to wipe out an entire position. 5 minutes to turn trained soldiers into scattered survivors. 5 minutes to change lives forever. A complete unit destroyed. A position eliminated. A reality irreversibly altered, all in less time than it takes to prepare a meal. Daniel collapsed behind what remained of a shattered structure, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to breathe. His body trembled with exhaustion, adrenaline, and shock in equal measure. Slowly, he raised his head. And what he saw stayed with him forever, not as a memory that time softens, but as a permanent image engraved with unalterable precision. The battlefield had disappeared. In the place where it had existed, there was destruction, fire burning over broken earth, smoke rising into the dark air, a strange stillness that felt almost unreal. Only a few figures moved among the ruins. The survivors. Those who were trying to understand what had happened to them, trying to gather the fragments of a reality that had been completely shattered. Hours later, reinforcements arrived. But there was nothing left to defend. The attack had been part of a larger strategy, calculated, precise, brutally efficient, in every detail. Daniel survived that day, but survival carries a cost that does not appear in military reports, that is not recorded in any document, that cannot be measured by any known metric. Years later, when asked about the war, he never spoke about victories or strategies. He never mentioned plans or commands. He never described battles in terms of territory gained or lost. He talked about those 5 minutes. Always those 5 minutes. As if the entire war, with all its years and all its experiences, could be reduced and understood through that single moment. To him, they had been the 5 longest minutes of his life, a contradiction that anyone who had not been there would find impossible to fully understand. 5 minutes where fear revealed its true power, not as weakness, but as brute force capable of completely paralyzing even the most trained and experienced. 5 minutes where courage emerged not from a place of calculated heroism, but from the most fundamental instinct, the refusal to leave another human being behind, even in the face of certain death. 5 minutes where the fragile nature of human existence was exposed without mercy, where it became clear that the line between being here and no longer being here was thinner than anyone would want to admit. The boy Daniel had saved never fully knew how much that moment had cost the sergeant, how much of that decision had remained within him, shaping every thought about war that would come after. And perhaps that is the nature of the truest acts of courage. They happen without calculation, without guarantee, without certainty of recognition. They happen because not happening is not an option that the conscience accepts. The physical battlefield was eventually cleared, rebuilt, erased from the landscape with time and human effort. But the internal battlefields last far longer than any physical structure. Every man who survived those 5 minutes carried something different with him for the rest of his life. Some carried the weight of what they saw. Others carried the unexpected lightness of still being alive. Daniel carried both, the weight and the lightness, the tragedy and the privilege. The memory of what had been lost, and the responsibility of carrying within him what had survived. Because sometimes that is how war works, not in the great strategic maps, not in the speeches of leaders, not in the stories of celebrated victories, but in 5 minutes of darkness and fog, where everything that matters is reduced to a choice that is both simple and impossible at the same time. Because sometimes it does not take an entire lifetime to change everything. Sometimes 5 minutes are enough to reveal who we are, what we are capable of, and what we choose to do when the entire world is crumbling around us. Sometimes 5 minutes are all it takes.